I'm pleased to tell you that Senator Roy Blunt is with us this morning. Senator, welcome. How are you today?
Hey, Gary, I'm good. It's good to be with you.
Great. I got a few things that I want to get through here today, and I know we're working with limited time, so let me start with Egypt. Question is, should the money keep flowing? Should we keep sending tax dollars to Egypt in spite of the fact that they had a coup?
The Islamic radical government there was well on the way toward overthrowing whatever democracy they had. Our only chance to influence Egypt right now is through the military, and I think our friends in Israel and generally would want us to continue to use those opportunities to have whatever influence we can to move them toward real democracy rather than radical Islam taking over their government.
Yeah, I'm not too thrilled with the Morsi government, but I'm just not convinced that it is the job of the United States to be the world's police department and to spend taxpayer money defending other countries. But that said, certainly if we don't, it's a significant amount of money. It's less money than it was when we started giving them $1.5 billion. But if we don't give it to them, the Russians or somebody else will. So the question is, do we want our influence there to continue, or do we want the Chinese and the Russians to have the influence there? And that's a legitimate question. I come down on the side of our influence, but you could argue the other side of that. The neighboring countries, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and UAE have just given about $10 billion to Egypt, trying to stabilize their country and their neighborhood. So it's not like we're the only people that care about this. And again, you can argue that it'd be better if we weren't there and the Russians were. I think it's better that we're there, but I respect a different view on that. I just hold a different view, I guess. All right, let me move on to the Marketplace Fairness Act, which you were really pushing. You were really behind. And I'm curious why we would want the Marketplace Fairness Act.
Because the law is on the books that people are supposed to pay this tax, and we either ought to take it off the books in our state or assist the interstate commerce implications of collecting it. Repressive governments have laws on the books that they know people don't obey. Democracies shouldn't have those kinds of laws. You and I are supposed to pay that voluntarily when we file our state income tax. Last year, 300 people said they got something through the mail that they didn't pay sales tax on and voluntarily paid it. I don't think that's probably the right level of compliance. If the Missouri legislature wants to eliminate the law, that's their business. If they don't, one of the principal reasons for the Constitution was to help regulate interstate commerce, and this is a tax that's due. It makes a big difference to the local merchant if the only difference in looking at their store and looking at a television or looking at a wedding dress or whatever is the 7.5% or 8% sales tax if you order it online. They're bearing all the local cost of sidewalks and police and everything else, but then people have figured out how to avoid a tax that they're supposed to pay, and I think it's the fair thing to do.
Wouldn't we be better off just telling every state to, and rely on the Interstate Commerce Clause to say, look, you can charge a sales tax on anything that's sold in your state. And that wouldn't be any different than if I'm traveling to Ohio and I buy a pack of cigarettes. They don't say, what state are you from? Let me charge you that sales tax rate. Just let the states do it themselves.
You could do that. You could do that.
And then we'd have less federal government.
I think the federal government would have to probably be involved in making that happen, but that's one other way to collect these taxes. And we may have as many people sending things out of our state as people sending things in. I don't know that. It might be about the same amount of money. I do know that the sales tax revenue is declining significantly because of online sales. And I do know that all of your advertisers there in Columbia are of the view that this gives them a disadvantage, and I think it does give them a disadvantage that's unfair. But there'd be another way to do this is to charge this tax to anything you sell in your state.
Right.
I'm sure the online merchants would probably resist that even more. But
they already do that, Senator. Right now, if I buy something in the state of Missouri online while I'm living in the state of Missouri, I have to pay Missouri sales tax. And so we're already at that point. And that works.
Exactly. Exactly.
And on top of that,
if they have a Missouri store, you're right. And in fact, if you buy from LL Bean in Maine, and if they had a Missouri store, you'd have to pay the sales tax, or at least if they had a store. I think if they had a store in your state, you'd pay the sales tax.
Right.
So I guess the other point here is they know how to calculate this tax.
Yeah.
It can't be that much trouble to calculate the tax. Why not calculate it? But I think the Marketplace Fairness Act is exactly that. And I'm going to go back to my original point, which I think you would agree with when you think about it. If you're not going to collect the tax, take the law off the books. Don't have a law that you know everybody violates. That is not a good thing for government. It's not a good thing for democracy. It's one of my biggest concerns about where the president is with the IRS and everything else. When government isn't fair with people begin to think they shouldn't be fair with the government, and all of this the IRS harassment and things we're seeing going on. I think the greatest danger there is actually that people are going to start saying, well, if the government's not fair with me, I'm not going to be fair with them. Again, repressive governments rule based on power. Democracy should rule based on trust, and you shouldn't have laws on the books that people aren't obeying. Take it off the books. If the Missouri legislature wants to do that, that's absolutely fine with me.
Well, that would mean that the states would be in charge. There'd be less federal regulations, which I'm sure you and I are both in favor of. And on top of that, it would be just one less bit of involvement from the federal government. If you just joined us, Senator Roy Blunt is with us this morning, and we've been talking about the Marketplace Fairness Act. We talked about Egypt, and I probably want to get on to a couple more things, talking about the IRS. There are a couple of other alternatives to a tax based on income. One of them is the fair tax, and I'm wondering where you stand on that.
I think if you were going to set up a brand new tax structure, that's a pretty good way to do it, and it's probably more competitive internationally than the tax structure we have. I do think that the president's use of the IRS has done a lot of damage to the whole concept of sort of a voluntary compliance with income tax, and it may be moving that debate to where people no longer trust the income tax system. Even for generally Americans, even if they disagreed with the income tax system, thought that it was fair. They might not like it, but they thought everybody got treated pretty much the same by the IRS. That begins to change when the IRS commissioner visits the White House 150 times in 4 years, when his predecessor went there one time in 4 years. And I think it raises the issue of talking about all the alternatives again. And in fact, the two Senate and House tax writing committees say they'd like to start with a blank slate and write a tax bill, but my guess is the president won't sign a tax bill that doesn't raise more revenue, and I wouldn't vote for one that does. So I think we're at a standoff as long as we have this president on changing the tax code for one way or another.
Let me, because we're really pushed for time here, I want to talk to you about Obamacare. The individual mandate, the House of Representatives is contemplating introducing legislation to get rid of it. Would you agree with that? Get rid of the individual mandate?
I've already voted to get rid of it in the Appropriations Committee this week. We had two amendments that I co-sponsored. One was not to fund the part of the bill that the president says he's not going to do, the employer requirement, and the second was not to provide any money to allow the implementation of the individual penalties. If you're not going to You can't. A bicycle with one wheel is not a very good thing to ride around on. And I think the president has dismantled this now, one step at a time, where we shouldn't move forward, and you certainly shouldn't have penalties for individuals as you eliminate the requirement for businesses.
Interestingly, early polling data showed that some people didn't like Obamacare because it didn't go far enough. Others didn't like it because it went too far. Currently, the polling data indicate that most Americans, and by a pretty significant margin, have decided they just don't like Obamacare. So I'm going to ask you your sense of the Democrats that you talked to on Capitol Hill. If the Republicans were to introduce more legislation just to get rid of it or defund it completely, do you think any of the Democrats, recognizing the popularity of getting rid of Obamacare, would join you?
I think in the Democrats in the Senate Appropriations Committee all voted to continue to move forward day before yesterday. All the Republicans voted not to move forward. I think you and I have talked about this before. I just think this is based on premises that don't work. It's based on people buying insurance, but you tell them they really don't have to get insurance because they can get it when they get sick. And it's based on young, healthy people buying insurance at higher levels than they've ever been asked to pay before. Those are two faulty principles right there. And then it's littered with all kinds of complications that one by one, even the Obama administration is saying, oh, that long-term care part won't work. Oh, we can't possibly have the small employer exchange for another year, even though they'd had 3.5 years to prepare for it.
I've got to interrupt you for just a second. We have to pause for just a moment. You're listening to the Gary Nolan Show, Senator Roy Blunt on the Zimmer Radio Network. Welcome. If you just joined us, Senator Roy Blunt is with us. We've been talking about Obamacare, defunding it, and he's just pointed out that the whole premise of Obamacare is somewhat faulty, and I certainly agree with that. And hopefully, and I actually think that this is going to give Republicans some momentum in the Senate, in the coming elections. I think this is going to give, because so many Americans don't like the program. I'm not sure if you'll ever get enough support to override a veto, but we can always hope. Let me move on to the Farm Bill very quickly before we run out of time here. The House has decided...
Can I make one more comment about Obamacare, Gary?
Sure.
The other thing that they decided to do, while they decided not to require the employer mandate, is to move forward on the taxpayer subsidies for families of up to 400% of poverty, with those families now being able to self-verify their income. So no longer any requirement that you show your tax return, you prove what your income was. You can now, so you're giving away the candy here, and you're not making anybody eat their spinach. You're trying to eliminate things that you know employers are going to hate, and you're moving even more aggressively toward giving people money to buy insurance with, and you're letting them decide what their income is going to be rather than show what their income is going to be. I think politically there's a lot of credit being given to the president for putting the hard parts of this off until after the 2014 elections. I hope you're right. I hope people see through this and realize we need to make a decision right now about the future of health care.
Does anybody remember the housing bubble? When you could go get a liar loan. I don't think there's a whole lot of difference.
Exactly. That's a great point, and Senator Isaacson made this point in a meeting I was in this week, that this is exactly the same premise to where people in housing could lie about their income. Now, to get more of a subsidy for taxpayers to pay your insurance, you can be misleading about that's a very good point. I'm glad you made it.
And it's going to cost taxpayers an awful lot of money we don't have. The Farm Bill. Right. Let me move on to the Farm Bill very quickly to wrap this up. In the House, they've separated the food stamps from the rest of the Farm Bill. How do you think that's going to wash in the Senate?
Well, not a single Democrat in the House voted for it, and there are more Democrats in the Senate than there are Republicans. I don't have any reason to believe that Democrats in the Senate wouldn't have the same view as Democrats in the House. So if you have a farm bill, I think it's going to have some of these nutrition programs in it, and we ought to reform them and make them as defensible as possible. But I think we need farm ag research. I think we need crop insurance. Not very costly in the years we've just gone through, but if you don't have it, it makes it really hard for farm families to go to the banker and say, here's how we pay this loan back if there's a devastating drought or a flood or all the things that can happen in agriculture. But not a single Democrat voted for the Farm Bill without the nutrition programs in it yesterday, and my guess is that would be the same in the Senate.
You know, in New Zealand, they got rid of all of their farm subsidies. And they screamed and hollered, and they thought it was a terrible idea that farmers would go out of business all over the place. And lo and behold, it had just the opposite effect. The farmers became more productive. Their profit margins were raised. Their government was taxing less, spending less. Why don't we just get rid of the Farm Bill?
Well, I actually think that parts of the Farm Bill are the reason that we're as successful in feeding the country and the world as we are. I'm for reforming the Farm Bill. In fact, the Senate Farm Bill had $40 billion less cost than if we just continue the path we're on now. I think really the two options are probably, do you reform the Farm Bill or do you extend what is essentially the Nancy Pelosi Farm Bill? And I think those are the two choices we face. New Zealand agriculture is interesting and different and largely livestock focused. We don't have much in terms of livestock programs either. We could eliminate our livestock programs, and with the exception of dairy, there wouldn't be much notice of that happening. And New Zealand agriculture is largely livestock, but it's a model to look at and to see how they were able to do what they were able to do and what their crop insurance environment is. Maybe with private sector crop insurance, which might work in our economy as well.
Yeah, agriculture contribution to New Zealand's GDP went up 14%. They've really turned things around by getting the government out of it. Last thing, I'm on the board of directors at a group called Downsize DC. And we have some legislation that has been introduced both in the Senate and the House. One of them is called the Read the Bills Act. And it says that if you sign onto a bill, if you vote yes on a piece of legislation, you either have to read it or have it read to you. We have also got introduced legislation that says one bill at a time. And as you know, in the Senate, a lot of times they'll piggyback legislation. They'll take something that's unpopular, throw it on something that's necessary to sneak it through. Would you be willing to sign on to those two pieces of legislation?
Yeah, I very well might. I'll look at both of them, and those are both great concepts, and let me look at the legislation and see.
Great. And the last piece that we have is the Write the Laws Act. A lot of times what happens is the Senate will say, for instance, well, we'll create the Environmental Protection Agency and we'll protect the environment. And then the EPA goes out and writes all these laws that make it difficult for people to keep their farms and to go to work. And then the legislature says, hey, I was just here to make sure that the environment was protected. In other words, the legislators are no longer held responsible. It's the EPA that's doing all the harm. And so what we want is a Write the Laws Act that says, you know, if Congress passes a law, they're the ones that write all the rules. In other words, it holds legislators accountable.
Right.
What do you think of that?
I'm for that. There's another piece of legislation I've co-sponsored for years and am again called the REINS Act. Putting the reins on government, I think, is where that REINS Act comes from. But it requires the Congress not to write the rules and regulations, but to approve all of them that have any economic consequence. I'm for that too. You know, either writing the rules or approving the rules. I think you might make the argument that the Congress may not be the best prepared to write every rule, but if they have to then approve every rule with a vote, it's essentially the same set of obligations that you're talking about, and I am for that. I think regulation is one of the things that's totally out of control, and in fact, I've got a hold on the EPA nominee right now for a couple of reasons, but one of them is that the government wants to fight with itself all the time and can't even agree on the facts of an issue, and we ought to insist the government agree on the facts and that the House and Senate take responsibility for rules and regulations.
Senator Blunt, thank you so much for spending some time with us this morning. We look forward to having you back on the program again. Take care.
Always good to be with you, and I will see you soon.
All right, Senator. Thank you very much.